Welcome back to the Frontier Podcast, the show where we interview the pioneers pushing technology and humankind into the future and going deep on the original cypherpunk values of cryptography, digital sovereignty, and the limits of human ingenuity. I'm your host, Tom Mitchell-Hill, and today I'll be joined by my co-host, Daniel Barr, the co-founder of SpaceComputer. Thanks for joining me, Daniel.
Greetings. Lovely to be here again.
Oh, you can actually do that. Oh, I've always struggled.
Today, we're speaking with Rand Hindi. Rand is an entrepreneur and deep tech investor. He is the CEO of Zama, a leading crypto privacy protocol, and a general partner at Unit VC, where he's invested in over 70 companies across the cryptography, AI, blockchain, and biotech sectors. Rand has been coding from an extremely early age. He founded a social network at 14, a web agency at 15, before getting into machine learning at the age of 18, starting a PhD at 21. He went on to found Snips, an AI startup that was acquired by Sonos and is now powering a voice assistant in over 20 million devices. Now he leads Zama. Rand, thanks so much for joining us on the Frontier Podcast.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Awesome. Matt, I'd love to start off with your background and journey kind of as a hacker and entrepreneur. This is a multi-part question, but can you share some details on like the different perspectives of being kind of like academic researcher background versus being an entrepreneur and the benefits of having that technical depth as a founder?
You know, when I was actually studying, maybe a little bit of backstory here. So because I've been coding since such a young age, when I was graduating from high school and deciding what should I actually study, I kind of got lazy and decided to do computer science. You know, I thought, well, you know, how hard can it be if I'm already basically a developer? And unsurprisingly, I was kind of bored my first year in college. And so I decided to take some, master's classes, including one in artificial intelligence. And I remember at the time thinking, oh my God, like this is actually going to change everything. You know, we're going to go from programming computers to teaching computers to do things. And so my first year in college, I knew that AI was going to be my thing. And so right after my bachelor's, I went straight from bachelor's to PhD, skipping master's. Well, because I had done a master effectively, during my bachelor's. And that's when I actually started thinking that maybe there is something more than just pure AI. Maybe there is something interesting around using artificial intelligence for, biology, for healthcare. And my PhD was actually in something called protein folding. So applying machine learning to learn how molecules are structured in space. 20 years ago, to be clear, at the time, we could barely make any AI stuff work. But it was interesting because Demis Hassabis, the founder of DeepMind, actually got the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago specifically for solving protein folding with AI. I guess it just took 20 years and $20 billion to get there, but I guess the idea was not so bad at the time. That's just a long story short to say that, I've usually always found interest in working in topics that were not yet very mainstream. And so for me, academia was not so much about becoming a researcher as it was about an opportunity to work on something that wasn't necessarily a business. And then I figured eventually as a founder that, well, everything can be turned into a business if you actually try to figure out what the product can be. And so I'm still kind of trying to do the same thing, trying to work on very frontier stuff, but now actually trying to turn that into a company instead of just a few papers.
It's interesting in academia that oftentimes the specific topic of a PhD student is like the niche of a niche, but the skill set is something that brings so much, right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, look, I think doing a PhD taught me two things. The first thing is it taught me how to actually do research without any prior art in a way, right? So like you're basically given like a topic which is super big, super hard, and you're like, look, figure out something related to that topic. And when you're a founder, it's a little bit like that too, like you're looking at blockchain. Blockchain is a huge space. You could be building 1,000 different products within the space. So how do you actually decide what to build? How do you conduct experiments to figure out that what you're building is actually meaningful? That's research. It's just, instead of publishing a paper, you're basically making money. That's how you know that this is actually useful.
Can you walk me through how you went from kind of like AI machine learning side into cryptography? What did that path look like?
When you work in AI, you basically spend your time looking at data, right? And when you work specifically on biology, DNA related stuff, you look at a lot of very personal data. So for me, it was very clear that the more we use AI, the more data we need to trust to those AI, and therefore the more privacy becomes an issue. So when I started my company Snips, we set out to actually build one of the first AI assistant that actually had privacy built in. The way we did that at the time was that we ran everything on device. So there was no data being sent to the cloud, but it was very limited because you couldn't really compute that much on a Raspberry Pi, right? I mean, it's okay for basic stuff, but clearly things like LLMs today would never fit on a Raspberry Pi. So I started looking for other things. How could we potentially have privacy server side? And that's where I came across FHE, fully homomorphic encryption. And I remember it was back in 2015. I looked at that and I was like, oh my God, this is clearly the future, not just of AI, but of potentially any kind of computation where sensitive data is involved. So it's been a decade getting to this point. And arguably, blockchain became the real product market fit for FHE, not AI. But I mean, from that point onwards, I just couldn't go back. Like it was just impossible for me to imagine that you could have a world where all your data is piped to companies and then not have any privacy around it.
You were kind of building privacy tech before it was cool. What was the journey of Snips, and how did the kind of privacy by design influence your decisions?
We could even talk about Zama directly because, to be fair, privacy got cool, 3 months ago, right?
Zcash popped up and everyone's like, oh my goodness.
Got mainstream, yeah.
Privacy, yay. Yeah.
Talk about good timing and being lucky, right? You can't really make this up. People realizing suddenly that privacy is important. It's not that nobody cared about it, right? It's just that up until now, if you look at Web 2 specifically, there was really no reason to force companies to adopt those privacy technologies. Because look, people trust OpenAI, they trust Google, right? And so far, at least, Google has not messed up as bad as other companies have in terms of privacy. So the incentive for Google to put massive amount of efforts into doing everything private is just not there. In blockchain, however, is completely different because on a blockchain, everything is public. If you want any level of privacy on a public blockchain like Ethereum, you have to use confidential computing technologies, FHE or otherwise, to do that. There's just no choice. Like you cannot just trust a company not to leak your data and keep it private. So I think that's a reason why people care about privacy suddenly in blockchain. Is not that they care about privacy, is that they realize that without confidentiality, we're never going to build all those use cases where data has to be kept confidential.
There's another industry that is obviously related. Financial industry also, privacy is super important. Is there any appetite or place where it's... Yeah, it's very linked, yeah.
Right? Because they're moving to blockchain. So when we talk about blockchain going private, what's really driving that is finance moving on chain, right? Yeah. So the opportunity today in confidential compute on chain is really just finance. I don't think it's necessary to go after financial use cases who are not going to be on chain because within a decade, all of finance will be blockchain related anyways. So might as well just kind of catch that wave going. There are other industries long term that I see outside of blockchain where this could be useful. For example, healthcare, right? That's always going to be an issue. And it's unlikely that would benefit from blockchain in the same sense because you typically have gigantic data sets with very few people that need to collaborate on it, as opposed to finance, which is very tiny data with 8 billion people involved. So it's kind of like
shared ledgers. Shared ledgers.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and it's interesting maybe, just like to your comment there, you're saying in a decade from now, blockchain will eat finance, kind of like what Andreessen was calling software eats everything. So like blockchain 100%. Will eat finance rather than looking at TradFi becoming something that is auxiliary. It's like it's going to be contained in on-chain finance, basically.
And it won't even be TradFi versus ZFi. It'll just be finance.
Yeah. Right. Kind of like online, right? Online became the default, so on-chain becomes the default.
Yeah. Like nobody today builds a website. You build a service. The fact that you're on the internet with a web presence is just part of what you're building. And I think, all of fintech, all of finance is going to eventually use blockchain rails as opposed to TradFi rails because it's just more effective. That's it.
Okay.
And it needs confidentiality, obviously. Yeah.
And it needs confidentiality. You wouldn't want your, actually, I did that. I went to the street the other day. I walked up to random people asking them to show me their bank account. Nobody said yes. Like, there you go, right? I mean, people don't want other people to see how much money they have, period. You can brag with a nice car, but you're never going to show your real bank account to everybody else.
For those who haven't heard about it yet, can you explain what Zama is and how it all works?
Sure. So Zama is a confidentiality layer for public blockchains. So we add a layer of privacy on top of Ethereum, Solana, Base, so that any asset you have there can be converted to a confidential token where balances and transfer amounts are encrypted. And now that they're encrypted, you can start staking them confidentially, you can swap them confidentially, you can trade them confidentially. So anything you can do with a token on a public chain today, you can now do confidentially with the same token on the same chain with Zama.
How does that work with like the regulation side in terms of like confidentiality and privacy on that front?
The same way as TradFi works. When you have a bank account, you see your bank account, but your bank also sees your bank account, so they can comply with whatever regulation they have. The model we're proposing for compliance in the Zama protocol is the same. So the token issuer or the DeFi app basically can give themselves the right to see all of the transactions going through their own contracts, which means that they can comply off-chain with any regulation they need. So the kind of privacy we think that you need to build if you want compliance is not as much as I would like to, but it's not end-to-end encryption. It's actually more of a privacy with regards to your neighbor type of encryption, right? So I see my data, the service provider sees my data, but anybody else on chain and my neighbor doesn't. And I don't think there is a shortcut though, because if you really want blockchain to be used for $100 trillion of assets, you can't expect finance to change the rule of how it works. And so we want to make sure that whatever people want to do compliance-wise, they can do directly in the protocol.
Okay. Before we mentioned the term like FHE a fair bit, and I do want to get into like a slight like semi non-technical breakdown of those terms in a sec. But for FHE itself was considered kind of like borderline, sci-fi, the frontier of privacy. I'd like to hear your thoughts on like the early efforts of taking the academic concept of FHE and, actually demonstrating confidential transactions and what that process looked like.
Yeah. So FHE as a technology is not new. It's been around since the 70s. The problem is that it didn't work that well. You could barely do anything. So you could add numbers, you could multiply numbers, but you couldn't do machine learning, you couldn't do smart contracts or swaps or things like that. So the first thing that Zama solved is making FHE applicable to any kind of use case. So now you can use it for anything that you want. The second problem is that it was very, very hard to use for developers. You needed to learn a new language, you needed to learn cryptography. If you wanted to compute privately on something, you needed to be a cryptographer. So we've also solved that by integrating FHE into existing developer workflows. So for example, if you want to build a confidential smart contract or DeFi app, you just write a Solidity contract that you deploy to Ethereum that people interact with MetaMask. So we've removed all of kind of the complexity of integration. And finally, the third thing that was missing was performance. When we started a company, doing something like a confidential stablecoin transfer would take about 1 minute. It's not bad. It's better than Bitcoin, but it's hardly what people expect from blockchains today, right? So yeah, sure, okay. 5 years ago, we could have done like encrypted Bitcoin, but you not have been able to do encrypted Solana or global payments. So since then, we've actually improved the performance by 400,000x actually on some use cases. So we can now do about 1,000 confidential transfers per second on GPUs. And we're working on building an ASIC, which will get us to 100,000 TPS in the next 4 years. So
dedicated hardware.
Yeah, I mean, you have to at some point,
Very
right?
Cool.
So FHE is a done deal. Like it's no longer a math problem. It's just a compute problem, which fortunately is just a money problem. So the more money we invest in making it faster, the bigger the addressable market for this technology.
For the non-technical listeners, and I'll kind of put my hand up and include myself in that crew. Can you break down what's meant by FHE and how it differs from stuff like ZK, TEE, MPC, all the acronyms?
Okay, so sorry, Daniel, I might trash teas a little bit. Okay. But you're solving the reason I'm trashing them, so it's okay, right? You can talk about SpaceComputer. So there are typically 4 types of technologies when it comes to confidentiality for blockchain. So I'm going to talk about the blockchain use case specifically. So FHE, which means fully homomorphic encryption, which is a way for you to compute on encrypted data without decrypting it. So for example, imagine that you have a token, right? Your balance is on chain, encrypted. The amount you're sending is encrypted. The way that you've encrypted it still allows you to compute on the encrypted data itself. So you can have a smart contract that's manipulating this encrypted state on chain and transforming it into whatever you actually want. So the nice thing about FHE is that you can manipulate an encrypted state. And that's really the power of it, is that you're not changing the way blockchains work. You're just basically doing it over encrypted data instead of public data. FHE is also post-quantum, so the data you're encrypting and putting on chain cannot be broken by quantum computers, which arguably I think is an important thing to keep in mind. Now, if you compare that to other technologies, let's take, for example, MPC. Multi-party computation, you take the secret key and you split it with a bunch of people who need to basically collaborate to do a computation. MPC is the best tool that exists for managing keys and for managing decryption. So we use it in the Zama protocol for decrypting, for example, the balance when a user wants to see how much tokens they have. But when you want to use it for computation, it's very hard to scale because the scalability depends on how many people are basically participating. And importantly, it's hard to make it verifiable. You basically have to trust that people doing the computation, they've done it correctly. FHE is publicly verifiable. Anybody can recompute and see that the state is correct. ZK, great technology for scalability. However, when you're using ZK for privacy, it doesn't give you composability. I can send you Zcash privately, but I cannot stake my shielded Zcash. I cannot swap my shielded Zcash. I cannot do any of those things. FHE is composable. So your FHE tokens, you can stake them, swap them, lend them. Anything you can do with a token, you can do with FHE. So you see, it gives you security, composability, and verifiability, which is really important. Now, T's, in theory, give you similar properties. The problem with T's is that there has been multiple papers published recently that show that if you have physical access to the machine running the trusted enclave, the hardware, you can basically break it. We can go into the detail of how that works, but in practice, Intel fucked up. And so everybody using Intel T's effectively, well, if the attacker can run the machine direct. So the only way to make T secure is to somehow make it out of reach of, people,
If only
right?
someone was doing this.
Physically isolated.
Yeah, if only, right? But I want to be very clear. There's always, in every cryptography protocol, there's always going to be at some point, some hardware that is going to be used for holding secret keys. It's true in MPC, it's true in banks. And so someone has to figure out how to build secure hardware, at least for managing keys, that doesn't have this kind of side channel thing. And so that's why I'm an investor, by the way, in your company, Daniel, right? Is because I think it's a very good solution. Just put it in space.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? Absolutely. Basically, the highest security guarantee is physical isolation, right? So if it's truly physically isolated.
Yeah, and highest in your case makes sense, right? It's literally high in space.
Out of this world,
Exactly.
We talked about this a tiny bit before, but privacy has become a meta, if you will, particularly with traders in crypto now as well, because Zcash has put in an incredible gain over the last few months. What do you make of the state of privacy in crypto at the moment? And what are the flaws with Zcash in terms of privacy that you see? Because it's an older technology, so maybe flaws is the wrong way of putting it. But what's your read on Zcash as an asset protocol?
So there's nothing wrong with Zcash. I mean, I've been holding Zcash for a while, by the way. Thank you is finally doing something, right? But
same since 2016.
It's been a while.
Years. Yeah,
it's been a while. Yeah. No, look, Zcash is great. And I think for what it wants to be, encrypted Bitcoin, it makes total sense. So I do think genuinely that Zcash has an opportunity to be encrypted store of value, effectively encrypted Bitcoin. I would prefer if we actually encrypted Bitcoin, but I'll be happy with Zcash as well. It's a very different purpose than what companies like Zama are doing, because in our case, we're not building a privacy coin or encrypted store of value. We're actually building an infrastructure that allows anybody to build confidential applications, whether it's confidential stablecoins or confidential DeFi or confidential games on public chains. So if you wanted to build a Zcash-like store of value, you could technically bridge Bitcoin to Ethereum, encrypt it with Zama, and you'll have like encrypted Bitcoin, right? But again, Bitcoin exists in parallel to Ethereum and Solana. So I do think Zcash is going to exist in parallel to confidential chains, Ethereum plus Zama, for example.
That's an interesting game theoretic angle there, because I remember in the early days of Ethereum, I used to always think there's no point in Bitcoin. It could just be a smart contract ultimately.
Yeah.
And similarly, like that line of thinking of you could hypothetically take something like Zcash or Bitcoin and encrypt it with FHE on Ethereum or on something else, and ultimately circumvent the entire need. But I think that a part of the reason for these parallels to exist, as you said, it's because the network economics functions differently, not only from the 21 million finite coins as well. It's also proof of work that is different to proof of stake, and all of that mechanism of it's creating a completely different economy, right? So it's like these things will exist in parallel. I feel like we're
100%.
definitely aligned on multi-chain, right? Like
I don't think Bitcoin would have value if it was proof of stake, because as you said, people would just use Ethereum and have just a random contract on it. So what Bitcoin is really kind of giving you is security by just energy consumption, right? Yeah. And I think that's going to be hard to beat with a smart contract on any chain because of the amount of infrastructure that goes behind it. Now, I also think that in the beginning, when we thought that we could just replicate Bitcoin, is also because we used to think of Bitcoin as currency. The narrative of Bitcoin as digital gold is relatively new, I would say. So, the narrative shifted a bit. My personal sort of thesis is I think one of the reasons why Bitcoin has so much value is because Bitcoin doesn't have a roadmap. And I think this is really important. The moment you have a product roadmap, like Ethereum has, like Solana has, like any company has, right? You're taking the risk of being wrong and losing users and volume to other people who had the right strategy, right? If you're not changing anything, you can't actually be wrong, right? Like, it's never going to change. And so I thought about it the other day. I was like, if I had to stash something for 20 years, which crypto would I feel almost 100% confident would still exist and not be worth zero in 20 years? I couldn't think of anything else than Bitcoin, precisely because there is no roadmap, and therefore there is no strategic mistake that can be made with Bitcoin.
It's in some respects the lowest risk of being disrupted, but it's not without risk, because a lot of things can happen.
Of course, well, quantum computers for one. So you are going to have to upgrade Bitcoin to be post-quantum. That's one. But you're not like Bitcoin is not trying to be something else than Bitcoin. That's where I'm trying to get to. Right. And I really understand that people pushing strongly against smart contracts on Bitcoin because it would denature it and it would make it just like another Ethereum or Solana, and we don't need that.
Yeah.
You mentioned before that you would almost like to encrypt Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Why can't we encrypt Bitcoin?
Well, you could. I think Starknet is trying to do that, right? Sure. So I think people are trying to do that. But would you actually want to encrypt Bitcoin, or would you want to have like an encrypted Bitcoin stablecoin, if that makes sense, right?
Like a wrapped Bitcoin.
A wrapped Bitcoin, exactly. And so if you have a wrapped Bitcoin, what's interesting is you can now have basically yield, and you can basically have it like as part of DeFi. And that's where confidentiality comes in. I think, the canonical Bitcoin chain, like nobody sends Bitcoin to other people, right? Like there's you don't really need confidentiality in the sense that there is nothing to track in the first place. Like people just buy and hold Bitcoin, that's it, right? And if you only want to hide who you are when you deposit, it's easy to do that. What's difficult is hiding ongoing activity, daily payments, swaps, things like that. And that, again, that's not what people do with Bitcoin, right? Look at the transaction volume. Like, I don't think anybody's filling blocks anymore. At least not on mainnet, right?
I've had two Bitcoin transactions on mainnet this past month, so but
Look,
maybe I'm an anomaly.
I actually tried to do a few Bitcoin transactions. During the whole what is it called, like the NFTs on Bitcoin era, and the Bitcoin
Ordinals.
tokens,
Inscriptions.
Ordinals. Sorry, yeah, ordinals.
The RC20s, yep.
Yeah, so like I went and I bought a bunch of random ordinals, right? Yeah, I mean, I like to try early stuff. I mean, we think Ethereum is slow, right? 12-second block times. Man, Bitcoin is. I made a transaction. I went for coffee, came back, and like it was still not done. It's not just that the block time is 10 minutes, it's that you need like 40 confirmations to make sure you have finality, which is by design, and I get it, but not exactly something that you're going to be transacting on a daily basis for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
Runes meta was tough. I have a friend who is very, very involved in Runes, and yeah, he was showing me how to do things, and yeah, stuff taking 40 minutes. I was like, did I do the wrong transaction here?
Yeah.
Like, no, you just have to wait an hour. And I was like,
yeah. And again, like I think that's a good thing. Like this is what you want from a store of value. You want something that's just not going to change. That's it. And so I'm wholeheartedly on the camp of let's not change anything to Bitcoin.
Yep, I agree. I'm in the camp as well. Can you talk about your intuition about space compute, terrestrial compute? Seeing the growth across launch providers, satellite infra providers. Rising interest in.
I think it's one of those things. When you think about it from first principles, it makes a ton of sense. If you think about not just privacy, but if you think about compute in general, right? Data centers cost a lot of money, right? It takes a lot of energy to run them, to cool them. Well, if you're basically facing the sun 24/7 all year long, right, without the atmosphere filtering anything, you've got a pretty efficient way of capturing and using energy, right? So for me, I think it's very obvious that the way that you're going to scale to the energy demands of Bitcoin or AI is not going to be on Earth. It's going to be in space. Even with fusion on Earth, it's never going to be as efficient of just putting stuff in space. Like you literally have an infinite amount of volume. Free energy, free space, no pun intended, right? And now we can send stuff in space more cheaply, right? So it's becoming also easier to put stuff in space. So the actual operating and kind of capex of building a space data center makes sense. So I'm a very big believer in space data centers. I think they make a ton of sense. And within, the kind of space data center kind of meta, then obviously, the thing I'm interested in is, okay, how do you actually do something securely, right? Someone is still going to have root access to that server. So the question becomes, how do you build very strong software isolation for space, servers? And the answer to that is using a T. Like I look at T's as software isolation solution more than hardware security, right? It's basically a way to make sure that your software cannot be accessed by other software on the machine. And at doing that is very, very good, to be honest, right? It's much better than whatever, OS kernel level process separation, because like it's actually encrypting the memory. So that's how I see this. I see this as put data centers in space, they're out of reach, you're reducing the security problem to basically a software problem, and for that, T's are actually a very good solution.
It's interesting you mentioned that you're looking at it as a software isolation rather than pure hardware, because and then that you also mentioned for Zama, eventually you'll be looking at ASICs. Because for us, originally, we were thinking that we're only going to be focusing on protocol and software and going to be able to rely on various different kind of hardware providers. But over time, we realized that even though space is really booming and everything, we actually do need to get into quite particular hardware integration to get what we want out of it. And then ultimately, also, as you see the trend in not only space-based data centers, just like the space compute in general, there's most of it is going to be probably centralized providers. And therefore, what we believe is that there's going to be something that would be a settlement, a smart contract layer, a trust layer in orbit, essentially, to create that free market economy, a marketplace for compute
Totally.
services in orbit.
Yeah, I think, you're replacing the trust assumption of having a man with a gun in front of your data center, which is basically having it in space. But once you've solved the physical access security problem, you still need a very good isolation technology to avoid people, just reading whatever is running on the computer itself. And regarding the ASIC, I totally agree with you. I think people for a long time were a little bit scared of building custom hardware. Bitcoin has done it very well from the beginning. Bitcoin mining ASICs. I mean, they've been around since 2013, 2012 even, I think. Like very quickly, they've been around. Any kind of compute where you have hyper-specialized, math-heavy kind of workflows, you're always going to be better off building an ASIC than using off-the-shelf GPUs and CPUs. And we see this with FHE as well. Every time we go from more general to more specific type of hardware, we get a 10x improvements. So going from CPU to GPU, you get instantly 10x better latency, but also 10x better throughput. So it's 100x better cost, performance per dollar improvements, right? And moving from GPU to FPGAs, we're starting to see the same. And moving from FPGA to ASIC, we're starting to see the same. So if you're going to be running the exact same computation 1 billion times a minute or 1 billion times a second, and you need that to go super fast, you're never going to do better than building custom hardware.
Yeah,
and
maybe over time, over time, hardware manufacturing cost also goes down. I reckon. Just like it's still expensive to go and do like microchips, but overall, it's becoming more accessible.
It is not as expensive as it used to be. I mean, today you can build an ASIC on a 3 nanometer TSMC node for 30 mil. It's a lot of money, 30 mil, but like 30 mil is not, you don't need to be NVIDIA to spend 30 mil building an ASIC, right?
Yeah. Like talk 10 years ago, it wouldn't be like realistic at all.
No, impossible.
I want to take it back a little bit more to the kind of like founder frontier side for a sec. When you were, when Snips was acquired by Sonos, what was your experience founder POV? What was the like aha moment afterwards that kind of like led you as exited founder to take on kind of the ambitious goal of pioneering implementation of FHE specifically for crypto?
As I mentioned earlier, I discovered FHE in 2015 when I was working on this company Snips before on Confidential AI. That's where I met my co-founder Pascal Payet, who's one of the inventors of FHE as well. And it really struck me as the future technology, but it didn't really work at the time, so we couldn't do much with it. When I was going through the acquisition process, which by the way, probably the hardest thing I've done as a founder, well, I don't know, maybe launching a token is harder than selling a company. I would say it's equally complicated, right? Lots of moving parts, everything can go wrong. I would say I'd put it on equal footing. When I was going through the acquisition, Pascal, who was a friend, called me and say, hey, there are some new breakthroughs in FHE. I think, we can make this technology work. Do you want to start a company in FHE? And I was like, I don't know, man. Like, I'm a little bit burnt out. I was going to, I want to go to Japan, spend 6 months, eating great sushi and going to all of those amazing places. I love Japan, that's why. So my plan was to travel to Japan for 6 months and then figure out what my next move was going to be. But then I thought about it. I was like, hold on. I've been telling everyone for 5 years that this technology is going to be the future. I'm super excited about privacy. There's an opportunity for me to build a company with literally the #1 researcher on the planet in that field. I can't really, it's just my founder spirit just took over. I was like, fuck it, let's do it. So a week after I closed the acquisition of my company, we started Zama. So no break, no traveling to Japan. I still haven't been.
Haven't been.
So it's been, no, I've been plenty of times. I mean, I still haven't been 6 months there. But yeah, look, I mean, it's honestly best decision I've made because I think if you take too long of a break, it's a little bit difficult to get back on the saddle full speed. Here, I still was on super high energy from a previous company. Like there was no downtime. I just went straight from high intensity to high intensity startup founder mode. And I just like it. I don't know, maybe call me masochistic, but I just like, if I take more than 2 weeks of holiday, I just don't know what to do. I just go to my wife and I'm like, you want to do something? Like, I just become like this very annoying, very needy person that, is looking for something to do with his day. So yeah.
Chewing glass, always chewing glass.
Exactly.
Well, what's the obsession with Japan? Why Japan?
I just love the culture. I think it's they're amongst some of the nicest people I've met. The food is out of this world. I love collecting Japanese art as well. I find there is something that is, France has a good culture, but it looks like other European countries in some ways, right? Japan really has a unique culture. Like it's really a place that's out of space and time compared to the rest of the world. And I just like that. I like the dedication to being honest about who you are and to being like kind of unique.
Craftsmanship, like very high craftsmanship as well.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, you look at what they've been able to accomplish over the past millennia. It's insane.
Talking about Zama, I know there was like some kind of like slight backlash recently around kind of like open source first license software with Zama. And so I was just wondering, no, backlash is probably the wrong term for it, but what considerations kind of like guide those decisions? How do you view striking the balance between kind of like fully open source software and like the need to be like commercially viable as an organization?
I think we have to define better. So open source is different from free software, right? Free software means that the license and the code allows you to do whatever you want. Open source just means the code is publicly accessible, which is very different. The reason why Zama open sources everything is not because we want it to be free, it's because we want it to be publicly verifiable. We want people to know what's actually running to make sure that there is no bugs, there is no backdoor, there is no interference, whatever, right? And making your code open source is the only way that you can guarantee that. So for us, open source was primarily public verifiability driven, I would say. If you're a company, your goal is to make money. Let's be clear about that, right? A company is not a nonprofit. A company's objective is not to build public good software or stuff. The goal of the company is to make money. And so you have to think about how can you monetize and what's your best distribution strategy. And for us, we found that a dual licensing model where the software is free and open for research purposes, but you have to pay if you want to use it commercially, made sense. The Zama protocol, by the way, if you want to deploy on it, you can just deploy on it. It's a permissionless network. But if you want to use our technology outside of the Zama protocol, you're going to have to pay a license fee to us, which, seems reasonable, doesn't it? Yeah. Right? But somehow a lot of people think that everything should be free. I disagree. I think, if you want something to be free, go and build it in a university. If you're a company, you have to make money.
Part of the distinction maybe is that Ethereum went the foundation direction, which is kind of like Linux Foundation or something, whereas what you're describing is a bit more like Red Hat or something that essentially takes open source software but uses licensing in order to commercialize it, which is, there's no contradiction between it being open source. No. It's just a manner of commercialization.
Exactly. And I think, you really want both. Huh? You want some, I would say, nonprofit foundations who are really focused on long-term problems for which there is no business opportunity. Okay. That's just not what Zama is. Zama is a company. And so, as a company, we're here because we want to build something meaningful that also generates revenue.
You seem to have a pretty good appetite for risk. Clearly, starting multiple startups, constantly kind of like pushing the needle a bit. When it comes to risk taking, what are the mental models that you approach with risk and how you evaluate whether or not like a startup or a domain or a field is going to work?
I don't think there is a formula, to be honest. I'm trying to think about it with my investor hat on. a little bit. When I look at a new kind of industry, so first, usually I go out and I invest in things that I already am convinced are important to solve. Because, maybe I come across it, or maybe like I talk to a bunch of people and it's a recurring theme. I'm like, okay, interesting. There's something around that. Then what I try to look for is what I call founder market fit, right? So in a way, when you invest early stage in a company, you don't really care about what the company is doing. You care that the founders are the right people to solve that problem for that specific market. So I think this founder market fit kind of angle is something not a lot of investors will basically talk about. People like to have all kinds of like addressable market thesis and everything. All of that makes sense for a growth stage company. For an early stage company, the only question is, are the founders the right people to solve that problem? That's it, right? And if the answer is yes, and I think the problem you're solving is worth solving, then I'm going to be investing.
With Unit VC, what kind of inspired you to do like investing side? Because you're clearly like a talented founder, very technically proficient. But what made you want to like invest in early stage stuff as well?
Frankly, just because I didn't have time to build every company myself. So I figured, the second best thing I can do is at least invest in those. So what you'll see if you look at my portfolio on Unit VC is a lot of the companies I invested in are very kind of sci-fi, deep tech related companies. Because that's, all of these things, I'm like, look, this is an industry I'm interested in. If I had time, I could have built or would have built a company in that. So, I'm just going to find the people that are actually doing something in that and do whatever I can do to help them, whether it's like, money, whether it's advisory introductions. So I'm not a VC, to be clear. Unit VC only has I call that like a fake fund, in the sense that we pretend to be a fund, but it's really just my money. But we try at least to kind of run it professionally with my partner, Kyle, who's kind of managing the portfolio. But yeah, look, these are things I'm interested in personally. That's it.
What's your advice to founders that are approaching like the really hard deep tech problems?
I think you need to find investors who understand how deep tech investing works, right? A lot of investors that have been used to SaaS, fintech, consumer, they assume that you can build a prototype in 3 months and start getting traction numbers very quickly. So they look purely at numbers. What's your growth rate? What's your revenue? What's your monthly active user base? In deep tech, it doesn't work like that, because there is an incompressible period of time for you to actually build the thing, right? Like, FHE cannot be prototyped in 3 months. It takes years of research to get it to a point where it can be turned into a product. A satellite probably take at least a year for you to build it, and maybe another year to get the authorization to send it to space. Like, there is no shortcut to those things because they fundamentally take time. And if you understand that as an investor, then what you understand is that deep tech is about step functions. There is basically no market, and there is 5 to 10 companies with credible founders trying to be the first to solve a hard technical problem. And when they do, it creates a market overnight. And that's what you're looking for, right? You're looking for technologies and industries where solving that hard science or engineering problem immediately opens up a $100 billion kind of market opportunity. Space is a good example for that, right? Even if it took you 20 years to build like a spaceship, it's worth it because the market you're opening is gigantic. And that for me is, I think, is the number one thing is, as a founder building a deep tech company, you do not waste your time raising money from investors whose first question is, what's your revenue growth rate the first year? Like, that's not the point.
Yeah, actually, on that, I know you're saying that there is no clear SaaS style figures to track, but how do you, because there's like a bit of a researchy kind of atmosphere for deep tech, but how do you communicate what are some of the things that you would relay to investors, that even if they are like a patient or whatever, like what would be the metrics equivalent?
No, you need KPIs, of course, right? Those KPIs should be specific to what you're doing. So for example, I don't know, in your case, I don't know what exactly your KPIs are, but I would imagine it's something like speed and cost of, every gigahertz of compute in space or something like that, right? So some number that is easy to understand that you can show is getting improved quarter over quarter. So for Zama, for FHE, is very simple. It's things like how many confidential token transfers can we do per second, right? What is the cost of a confidential token transfer? What is it's very basic metrics, right? And as long as you can show that these numbers are going the right direction, oh, wow, so throughput has improved by 10x in a year, right? Cost has gone down by 100x in a year, then you see you're not talking about financial KPIs. You're talking about fundamentally technical KPIs, but those technical KPIs are related to, I would say, product readiness and market readiness of the technology. And for us, it was very clear. We're like, look, we know that our technology is going to be ready for production and for the market once we can at least run Ethereum in FHE. So as soon as we have more capacity than Ethereum mainnet can support, then we can be like, look, we can run Ethereum encrypted with FHE. That's a big enough kind of market to start with. And we achieved that this year. So, yeah.
Congrats. Yeah, that's epic benchmarking, basically. You have a reference for something that's already huge.
And I've told my investors, I was like, look, that's the goal. The day that I can show you that we can process more stablecoin transfers confidentially on Ethereum than Ethereum can process itself, then we're in business.
You were talking before about deep tech being something that almost has this like kind of like long tail explosion that then opens up a market somewhere down the line. It's indefinite, it's risky, but if it works, it essentially is like it's its own, it passes through that absorbing barrier, and then it's its own kind of like investable, it opens up the door to other investable opportunities. What are the deep tech stuff or sectors that you look at the moment that are, unnoticed now, but that you think will have probably the most impact from either, we could take it two directions, but like an investable side, but also just like a market opportunity side?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so maybe I can give you a couple of examples of things that have been early on that have played out nicely. So 5 years ago, more or less, when I started actively investing, one thing for me that was very clear is that we needed a completely new class of mental health drugs, right? You just look at the data, people are getting more depressed, anxious, whatever, and the whatever pharmaceutical drugs we have are not working anymore. So I was like, okay, big problem. One in three person in the world, in the developed world at least, are taking antidepressants at some point. So I was like, okay, that's like billions of people that are desperately looking for a better treatment. So I looked at the science. I was like, interesting. So there are all those people who are kind of like niche researchers in the psychedelic space, which are showing you that, oh, wow, if you're using psilocybin, if you're using even LSD, you're getting incredible remission rates for, mental health. And you look at this, you're like, interesting. It's illegal, but it's working. So what bet are you making? First, you're making a bet that regulation will go in the right direction eventually if the science shows them that this is important. And B, you're looking for the founders who are basically pioneering a new class of pharmaceutical drugs based on those, I would say, existing psychedelic kind of understanding. 5 years ago, crazy to say that. You go to an investor, you say, I'm going to invest in basically magic mushrooms as the cure for depression. Yeah, go back to Burning Man, dude, and just what the fuck are you talking about? I invested in a company in 2020. I invested at a $10 million valuation. That company got acquired by a large pharmaceutical lab a few months ago for $1.2 billion. Right? So yeah, that's a big X, right?
Yes.
Like, and this is what happens when you're right in deep tech, because you invest in something nobody thinks is possible or is legal or is a market, but when it does, boom, it becomes gigantic. So that's one example that was like very early and right. Another one that I've been very early on is longevity. So like I've been a competitive biohacker for nearly 20 years now. And for me, it was very obvious that at some point everybody was going to get into the whole longevity kind of space because, I mean, why not, right? Like it's, who doesn't want to live to 100 in perfect health? It's just that I think until COVID, most people didn't realize how far we were like medically wise, from getting to 100 years old. Like I think COVID was a very big turning point in people's understanding that medicine and healthcare needed like to leapfrog to something completely new and futuristic if we actually wanted to live to 100 years old. And I kind of was expecting that there was going to be like a wake up moment at some point. And if you look at the past 5 years, like longevity has become one of the biggest investable sector with one of the fastest growth of results scientifically of all of like medicine, right? And what used to be like a niche biohacker community on Reddit type of thing, you know, you now have multiple billion-dollar companies effectively actively promoting these things. So I think longevity is going to be one of the biggest opportunities. I think bigger than AI, man. Look, I mean, you know, like AI is great, blockchain is great, finance is great, but not dying is arguably, you know, the biggest market of all.
Yep. No, just look at the popularity of Brian Johnson, Andrew Huberman, anyone running protocols that makes people, you know, feel like they're getting education.
Everything these guys are doing, you can find on Reddit 10 years ago. Like I hang out on weird subreddits of people trying all kinds of weird biohacking shit. Everything is in it, man. Everything is in there.
You mentioned the term competitive biohacker. Can you talk more about the competitive aspect of that?
Yeah, that's newer, I guess. You know, Brian Johnson started this longevity leaderboard called Rejuvenation Olympics, where basically you can compete based on how slowly you're aging at the moment. So it's you know it's a way to measure your protocol versus others in a way. So right now my aging pace is 0.68. So effectively I'm aging, you know, 60% per year. Instead of, you know, 1 year, I'm aging effectively like whatever, 7 months, 8 months. That puts me in the top 20 on that leaderboard at the moment, globally, which is nice, right? But you know, top 20 it's like if you're like second or third in a competition, you're not first, right? So my goal now is to be top 5 or top 10 on the leaderboard, but that's a little bit harder. I think if you want to be top 10, you can't really do what I'm doing, which is this kind of 80-20 longevity protocol. I think you need to actually be like a longevity athlete like Brian Johnson is, and your life revolves around reducing your biological age. You know, I don't think you can be living in Europe sipping wine on weekends and hope to be in the top 10.
Maybe that's the secret.
It's part of it. It's part of it.
Okay.
My take on longevity, by the way, is that there's a lot of stuff that are maybe a bit more on the hacking indeed, which is, let's say, like NAD plus IV drip and whatnot, the things that are like somewhat synthetic. And then there's stuff that are very basic, which are actually much more foundational. Sleep, right? Like the sleep is the number one. Clean air, clean water, the general, like having your lifestyle, just like time for yoga, reflection, whatever it is, like.
There are 6 things. If you don't do those 6 things well, no amount of drugs or supplements or interventions will help you. You need to sleep well, eat well, exercise regularly, don't drink, don't smoke, and have friends. If you do those 6 things together, right, you're almost guaranteed to live to 100. Now, if you want to go to 120, 150, that's where you need to go advanced, right? That's where you start looking into, you know, modulating your metabolism and things like that. Or eventually, you know, organ replacement and whatever else, you know, will be available. But if you don't do those 6 things, nothing's going to work.
Yeah, that's kind of like the blue zones basics, right?
Yeah, it sounds very obvious, but most people don't do that, you know?
No, it's crazy how much everyone goes looking for like the silver bullet approach before they have just the most fundamental kind of layers of anything down.
Well, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, by the way. Huh? I mean, you know, if you look at weight loss, right? For 40 years, people told you it's a lifestyle thing. You know, you have to exercise, eat well, and then you lose weight, which is true. And then GLP-1 Ozempic came about, and now you actually have like a pill that makes you lose weight. So it's not impossible that you might have a pill that makes you, you know, muscular and healthy. It's just right now that pill doesn't exist. So if your goal in 2025 is to optimize for longevity, lifestyle is going to be a big part of that.
So the other side of it is also that longevity is not only about getting to 120, it's also getting there in a shape that is like every moment you're actually in a good state of mind and like having good lifestyle.
Look, I'm pretty happy where I am today. So if I can stay like that, 220, I'm good with that, right? I think, being in your 30s is probably the optimal in terms of like, balance of everything. So, stick to that would be the goal.
I saw a comedian, can't remember where, but it was talking about the idea of aging, but without kind of doing it healthily. It's similar to adding crust to the pizza was his analogy that I thought was quite good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I like crust, but yeah, I get the point.
Outside of those like 6 foundational things, what are the protocols for you that move the needle the most?
I think for me, one of the things that was like the most impactful was reducing, I would say, inflammation, right? So reducing inflammation, it sounds like very obvious, but most people that live in cities today are very inflamed. Lots of allergies, lots of, like stress and everything. So a lot of my protocol and a lot of the supplements I take is just basically reducing inflammation, right? So super powerful flavonoid extracts, so basically green tea extracts, more or less, or like citrus fruits extracts, things like that. So that's number one. Number two is improving blood flow. I think you can take any amount of supplements you want. If your body cannot actually bring it to the cell, well, it's not going to do much. So taking supplements to improve blood flow is a big part of my protocol now. And the third one is energy metabolism. So making sure that your body has enough energy to work properly. So whether you're taking, NAD, supplements or whatever, there are multiple things that you can try. So I think that's important. And all of that together, the kind of end game of what I'm trying to do is to maximize mitochondrial health and to maximize immune system health, because those two things are sufficient to fix any problem in your body, right? Like nobody, a few people do, but most people don't have cancer at 20, right? They don't have heart disease at 20, right? They don't have diabetes at 20 because your body can fix your own body. So if you can keep your body fixing itself, you can probably prevent most of the aging-related diseases that people suffer from.
Rand, where do you want people to go after they finish listening to the Frontier podcast? What do you want them to go check out?
Well, they should check out the Zama website, zama.org, of course. And if you're a founder that's building in the deep tech space, get in touch, Rand at unit.vc. We like to invest. My pitch to founders is that if they're pitching other investors and they don't get it, they should come to me instead.
Okay, wonderful. Rand, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me.